A very pleasant good afternoon to all of our viewers. We are delighted to have you with us on Let's Talk this afternoon. Let's Talk, of course, is a program where we discuss issues, challenging issues. And this afternoon, we have a very challenging issue that we're going to be discussing. We want to introduce our guests, but before we do so, we are going to invite all of our viewers to join us for a word of prayer. Shall we pray? Almighty Father and our God, we are grateful for the privilege and opportunity we have to share on Let's Talk today. We thank you for this medium, for the issues that we have been able to share. And we ask a very special blessing that you will be with us in a very special way, that you'll be with us this afternoon as we share, as we present this very important subject. Take full control and have your own way. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Amen.
So to our viewers this afternoon, we are talking about the moral fall of the pastor. It's one of those subjects that is somewhat tabooed, notwithstanding the perhaps I can say increasingly frequent occurrences of incidences in the news. This afternoon, that subject, the moral fall of the pastor, requires an individual with great experience, an individual who is mature and well-respected. And I have found the right person. We have with us this afternoon a retired pastor, immediate past president of the North Caribbean Conference of Seventh Adventists, Pastor Silton Browne. It is my great delight to have Pastor Browne on Let's Talk this afternoon. Pastor Browne, welcome.
Thank you, Pastor Greene.
We are delighted to have you. We are grateful for your presence with us, and you are, of course, a man of great experience. You have served many, many years in the youth department. I still have fond memories of you being an outstanding youth leader. You served at North Caribbean Conference as executive secretary, and of course, before your retirement, you functioned for quite a number of years as the president of that organization. You were my president, and I am delighted to have you on Let's Talk this afternoon. We are talking about a very challenging, difficult subject, one of those topics that is both uncomfortable and sensitive. You know, the pastor is considered in many circles as the man of God or the woman of God. People consider the pastor to be someone who should be an example of moral virtue. And this afternoon, we're here talking about the moral fall of the pastor. Let me begin by asking, is it unrealistic of people to have such high expectations of pastor? What does it really mean to be a spiritual leader? And are the expectations that people have reasonable?
Okay, very good question. I want you, please, to reconsider that question, to ask it again, because I want to beg of you permission to make a few remarks before beginning to answer your specific questions.
That's quite fine. Go right ahead.
Okay. First of all, I apologize for giggling when you were making your first general remarks. And that is because in some regard, I almost consider myself not qualified or meeting up to those lofty statements you were making of me, but want to make the point that I feel honored to have been asked of you, if at all it will work out to be fair to your audience in the long run. I want, though, quite seriously and soberly, to express to you my deep respect and appreciation for what you're doing on Let's Talk. I perceive this as a leader who is aware, who is relevant. And that is very important in the context of leadership. Permit me, I think I'm having an issue here of battery connectedness.
Okay, we're hearing you quite fine.
Pastor, battery is going low.
Well, in the meantime, folks,
Okay.
I think that
Yes.
probably yes, Pastor Browne, go right ahead.
Yes, my apology. Yes, I recognize the
Okay, we seem to have missed Pastor Browne there. We will just go on for a few minutes until he reconnects. Uh, it does appear that his battery went, but I'm pretty sure that that is a problem that will be easily and quickly corrected. So in just a few minutes, we will have him back with us. We apologize for that little disruption, but I feel pretty confident that he's going to be back with us in just a few moments. In the meantime, you know, we are dealing this afternoon with this sensitive subject of the moral fall of the pastor. And as I have shared on so many occasions, Let's Talk is a place where we discuss issues, real issues. We are not afraid to bring serious issues to the fore because these are issues that really do impact us as spiritual leaders, as individuals who have important roles to play. And as a church, we do need to confront the issues. The Bible does have all the answers, and we take that as important. And so on Let's Talk, we discuss pertinent and real issues. And the one we're discussing this afternoon is an important issue, especially in light of what's going on in the media these days, with so many reports of moral issues in ministry. And we thought that we would address that one this afternoon here on Let's Talk. We're still waiting for Pastor Browne to reconnect with us. Let's just see. Where he is. Okay, so he is going to be with us in a minute or two. We just asked Pastor Browne the question about the implications to the expectations of how people view spiritual leadership. And he was getting ready to respond to that when there was a connection problem. I am in touch with him. He is going to be rejoining in a few minutes. So I am just asking for all of our viewers to be patient with us for a brief moment until Pastor Browne comes back on. In the meantime, we will just invite you to listen to some instrumental music until we have. Okay, he's back with us, so we don't even need to do that. All right, just reconnecting at this time. Okay, Pastor Browne, we are happy to have you back.
Apologies for that technical glitch that militated against. Now I'm a little on, but let's move on. I was simply acknowledging that this is a relevant and progressive move because I think given all that is happening, there has been a vacuum and you have seen it as an opportunity and have been filling in beautifully with a number of very important topics with which you have chosen to talk. I simply have been watching you over a period of time and have been appreciating that, felt almost guilty that I'm giving you so much time, given my disconnection from the South Leeward Conference at this point in time. But really appreciate what you've been trying to do. In fact, I think apart from being progressive, you're also bold because some of the topics you have chosen to discuss. And so God be with you. Now, on to your question. Let me proceed quickly. You were saying?
So I was saying that we want to begin by talking about, by the way, thanks for the expression of commendations. We continue to do our best to be a relevant organization and to address the issues as they come. I was saying, let's begin by talking about the expectations that people hold of the pastor. What does it really mean to be a spiritual leader? And are these expectations realistic?
Okay. The issue of a spiritual leader is most sober, most serious, and in some regard, from the human perspective, the calling or title is almost too high for us to be so, you may say, to be so called. However, that is the reality. Hence, people having high expectations would be very normal. Now, that normality also means that sometimes they not only have very high expectations of the leader, but sometimes those expectations may be somewhat unrealistic, because the leader, though a spiritual person, though meaning well, and though committed, must always remember that he is also still human, and that as human, he is very much subject to error. In that sense, he depends completely on the Lord Jesus Christ. He depends on the power of God. He depends on the Holy Spirit to guide his life, or else lots of things could happen that could go wrong. And so in that regard, the expectations are outstanding and noble and high. And most of the time, the pastor is able to live up to those expectations with the help of God. If, however, there is the opening of the path to either be arrogant, to think that he can do it all by himself, to think of pride or allow pride to take control, etc., then various possibilities are possible. Hence, some leading to the moral falls that we have known about or heard about or read about are very likely to happen, because as human beings, we are vulnerable.
Well, Pastor, before we talk about the issue of the fall, actually, the Bible does say, to whom much is given, much is expected.
That's correct.
And I suppose that the leader of a spiritual organization is expected to be a spiritual person.
That's correct.
Now, let's say a bit, because I am asking this question in light of the fact that, there ought to be some personal responsibility here on the part of the leader. Mm-hmm. So my question at this time is, does a person just become spiritual because he or she is a pastor? How then does a pastor build spirituality, and what is the role of spirituality? How important it is for the pastor to be really strongly connected to God?
Very good question, Pastor. The first part of the question, no, a person is not spiritual simply because he has the title of pastor, or because he does a degree in the field and has been given employment. Beyond academic preparation, there must be a sense of call. And even that call or sense of call, however you may choose to label it, is not automatically guaranteeing the issue of spirituality. Spirituality is a very personal matter, And it is rooted in one's relationship, one's personal relationship with God, that is watered by prayer, constant prayer, study of God's word, and a mindset, a heart, as we may say, inclined to know God more and to do his will. Spirituality is deepened, therefore, not only by study and prayer, but by a disposition and a craving to want to grow, to move beyond where you are, to see the unfolding of God's will more and more in your life. And then, in a way, it is built as we consider ourselves as stewards. Stewards who must grow, who must move on from where we are, who must build upon what God has given us, what God has entrusted to us. And so to grow and be moving spiritually closer to God and to God's will. That engages the individual, therefore, also in a certain sense of accountability personally on his own level, apart from what he or she may establish with others. And I say that because in a way, the congregation holds the pastor accountable, or the membership, the administration or field may hold him accountable. And there's much advocacy for pastors to have what we call an accountability partner, or a mentor, someone whom they can relate to from time to time, that could seek to guide them and strengthen them and ask them the tough questions and or personal questions, etc. And so there are these things that would help to strengthen the pastor and help him to grow spiritually as he seeks to perform his role and to both widen as well as to protect his sphere of influence.
Well, thank you for that response. But now let's, especially as we want to get to this issue of the moral fall. These days, it is becoming a bit uncommon, not uncommon rather, but common to hear in the media stories of fallen pastors in other denominations. And, all of us would like to believe that, oh, that doesn't happen in the Seventh Adventist Church. The reality is it does happen. It
Yes.
does happen in the church. It's something we have to confront. I still remember my first encounter with a pastor and a moral fall, not a sexual issue, but it was, I wasn't quite a pastor. I wasn't into school, undergraduate studies as yet. I was still a layman carrying out my duties. But that had such a profound effect on me, that here was this pastor who was not going to be a pastor anymore. It really is very disturbing and very unsettling when a pastor falls. Can you speak to the impact of this on the church members, on the congregation?
Well, I almost want to give one of my favorite answers, which is yes or no. Because in a sense, it is hard to describe how tough that is, how serious that is. But on the yes side is that it is very, very serious. It is very devastating. And it is almost impossible to try to describe / quantify how serious or devastating that could be to members. I listened as you shared that impact, and for me, it is significant that I have encountered that long time ago, before I came to ministry. Namely, it was while I was actually at CUC at the time, now USC, studying theology. And I remember when one of the pastors on the island of Trinidad was removed from ministry or had an affair, whatever the situation is. And I recall in my youth, before I was married or anything of the sort, I was so outraged and impatient and unsympathetic, in a sense, annoyed that a pastor who was married would be so engaged, because in my innocence, figuring, well, we the single ones have to deal with issues of 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 being chaste and wait until we are married and so on. But if you're married already and you have a wife, what else, you know? And so that seemed so weird to me. But in time, in fact, it was only after I was married and thought that, you know, one was invincible, when the first sort of feeling of strange thing came to me. I was like, wait, hold a minute, this is what, you know, the thing could be, and so on. And one becomes very much aware of how important it is for the pastor to remain solidly grounded spiritually. And yes, it could devastate members, could make them feel embarrassed, ashamed of so many things, their church, their conference, that is a local church, their conference, and then question even issues with regards to the denomination, etc. It is most serious and painful, apart from being embarrassing sometimes.
I'm thinking that when you consider that so much rest on your faithfulness, you know, not that you are living your life in the sense that, well, if I do wrong, others are going to give up. But when you do wrong, and of course the pastor is human, but when there is a moral fall, we're talking about moral indiscretions. When you let down the trust that has been given to you, it can have such a devastating effect on the members. You know, there are individuals who want to give up on God, because if the pastor can't make it through this, then who can? That's sometimes the reasoning of members.
That's right, exactly.
Now,
that was my reasoning at the time.
okay, yeah.
In the early 1970s, by the way, so that's a while ago. That was about 1972.
Wow, yeah, pretty long time ago. Now, Pastor Browne, this may be a difficult question, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it. What makes a pastor fall? Let's talk a little bit about some of the issues. You know, you're excited about ministry. You're out there preaching the good news of salvation, and then we hear that something has happened. What are the issues?
Okay, thank you very much. That is so powerful and rich, because a question, because I must say also that whereas in a way I felt unworthy of this high honor that you have given to me of coming on to speak, I need to express appreciation to you for the challenge, because it has kind of set me reading and researching and just getting a feel for the subject. And there's so much out there, both within the Seventh-day Adventist Church and especially out in the wider Christian community. And so I could say, one, that not only is it a problem out there, but we do have the problem within the Seventh-day Adventist Church as well. In fact, if not only just to say it that way, I've ran into a number of articles, and some of them give different statistics. For example, there was a relatively recent one that was citing 40% of pastors, and it might be a little on the upbeat side of exaggeration, I'm not sure, but there seemed to be a reliable sense to that. But I have seen other articles, that number of others that seem to come down fairly solidly around the figure within the Seventh-day Adventist Church of 12% of our pastors who would have admitted to sexual violation within ministry and or adultery. And so we definitely know we have it. The what of the reasons for it are many and varied as I see it, or as I've read them, let me say it that way. The list includes, of course, the very first question you ask about, the issue of our spirituality and staying close to God and making sure that you're solidly grounded. But beyond that, one needs to guard well his relationship with his family. That is critical, that you have a very close bond with one spouse, and you're building on that, working on that solidly. There are things like the issue of your past, issues that you may have had unresolved in your youth. And there are other extended things like, for example, your exposure to pornography, either as a young person or as indeed they have discovered, even some pastors are engaged in pornography, and it's a serious issue that could influence and lead them off track. And we should understand the age to which we have come. I am learning that soberly. In fact, just January or so of this year, one of the programs I listen to from time to time, New Day Live, they were reporting on the outstanding camp to deal with pornography. And what caught my attention was that at that camp, which was mainly for adults, but they have a few younger people involved to any male, and they discovered that the most critical sort of problems they were looking at were issues of pornography as it impacts boys 9 to 14. And that blew me away, because I thought this was something for the older people. And so these things that are, as it were, in the air there, and would make for the undoing of the pastor.
Before you go on, Pastor Browne, you mentioned a few minutes ago the past history of the pastor, and I want to get back to that. We're talking about reasons why people, may encounter hiccups along the way, moral failures. I remember some years ago when the scandal came out in the Catholic Church.
Yes.
With these priests molesting so many of the parishioners, that they did an interview on BBC. I heard this on BBC. They were interviewing some of the offenders, and a good bit of them said that they went into ministry because they realized they had the problem, and ministry provided a good cover. Now, that was rather very revealing to me, that individuals who were challenged either went thinking that maybe ministry would take care of this challenge, or maybe nobody would suspect that I had that challenge. Now, this speaks, this speaks, I mean, it's almost disturbing, because you now begin to wonder, what's the motivation for some people going into ministry? You almost have free access to your parishioners. So that is a bit disturbing, unnerving there. If individuals who know that they have issues can find themselves in ministry.
Yes, that is a very serious thing, which is why one of our prolific writers on this subject actually says that some of the solution to this begins from premarital counseling and working with people to find out what are some of the issues, and to sort of make sure that they're really safe to be in ministry and around people of the opposite sex, etc. So that is a very serious matter indeed. And if I may continue with some of the reasons, in fact, even success. Okay, workaholism could be another one. If you're too engaged and neglecting yourself and your family and so on, these some the things that lead to extramarital affairs and infidelity. In my reading, one of the articles that grabbed my attention was one that basically said that it was entitled "Why Moral Failure Happens When Ministry is Going Great." When ministry is going great. And in that article, the author pointed out that gave a number of reasons why these come. He says, one, pride goes before a fall. Two, because everyone appears to be going great. Everything appears to be going great. Everyone assumes that the pastor is doing great. Then three, pastors themselves think they are doing fine. Four, spiritual attacks ramp up while spiritual vigilance goes down. Five, success invites pressure and stress. Take note of that, which can bring back old enemies. Six, opportunities for an affair increase with popularity. Seven, ministry growth can lead to an unhappy spouse at home. So there's some of these things that even appear to be good things happening that could, if one isn't very balanced, very alert, and seeking to keep that balance in constant check, one could easily fall off on the wrong end or get attached. For example, in the success issue, affirmation. If a person needs affirmation, if your ego needs to be stroked, and so you're working hard, and as you get affirmation, the more affirmation you get, the more vulnerable you can become, and the more others or can see in these. One, others would want to get close to you. Others might be very generous in their affirmation or compliments, etc. And so some of these things lead the pastor off into the wrong track sometimes.
Now, I don't know if in your research, in your reading, or in your own experience, you have found any information on this, which I'm going to ask you now. A lot of times people assume that when we say pastor, we're talking about a man.
Oh, dear me, please.
There is an increasing number of women who are in the pastor.
Thank you very much. And my apologies for not addressing that up front, because it was my intention to in those early remarks, which is to have made the point that I am very much aware that in ministry, they're about males and females, and that sometimes, though, it's a little awkward in the discussion to keep him or her and that kind of stuff. And I wanted to ask that any reference to the pastor and his spouse or wife would be understood as either male or female and not necessarily man alone, although we know that it is a predominantly male field and also a predominantly male problem or issue.
So my question here, Pastor Browne, is have you come across any statistics that speak to the frequency of moral failures on the part of female pastors as opposed to male pastors? Okay.
A short answer to that is no. I mean, I say short answer because they have not given a very firm statistic or data on that. What they have acknowledged, though, that is less of the case among females. Although there was some other data I was looking at recently that shows that professional women were now increasing the number of affairs, but that is not necessarily in ministry, but in the general population. That whereas men have 3 times as many affairs as women, that they have stayed at their approximately 35% rate of men who are unfaithful to their spouses. But women, on the other hand, who come in much lower, but they have, in recent times, in the last few years, they have had something of a 40% increase of what the female rate has been. So there are issues here, which means I must quickly hasten to say to our female pastors, although what we are saying by and large may have an emphasis on the male because of the traditional male ministry and the lesser number of women in ministry, yet you should not take it for granted or become lax and feel unduly comfortable. You must also remain steadfast, alert, and committed to God.
Now, our time is going, and our question, our topic rather, is should the pastor be forgiven? With this moral issue. So, I want to speak to that a little bit. When a pastor falls morally, whether it be embezzlement of funds or sexual failures, as the case may be, adultery, unfaithfulness to his or her spouse, what happens? What's the likely penalty for such a fall?
Well, actually, there are a number of ways of dealing with these issues, especially if you move them from just the adultery thing, which essentially we are focused upon. But in staying focused on the adultery issue, there is a strong tension between the theory and the practice, between what we may feel versus what may be theologically sound or right. So let me make it very clear that there's nothing pleasant or easy about the issue of the pastor on a moral fall. In fact, let me take the easier path of identifying that the question of should he be forgiven. Let us say that theoretically and theologically, we are ultimately compelled to say, well, yes, the pastor, or as a person, just like anybody else, should be forgiven for a sin or a wrong that he has done. And so it is theologically sound to consider forgiveness, and God is of that nature. That having been said, however, the issue is far more practical, sobering, and serious than just a casual theological declaration or pronouncement, because of the nature of ministry, the nature of people, and the nature of the call/ordination of that pastor in ministry. Hence, that makes it, as in the name of one author, makes it almost essentially impossible to reinstate that pastor into his position of pastoral leadership. Now, and here are some of the reasons for that, Pastor. The ministry is not just the issue of a call. It's not just a contract. It is one with heavily loaded moral responsibility and accountability. That is why even where a pastor is operating on equal footing in an affair, or may even be seduced, etc., he is not held in any way excusable, because the pastor is viewed as in a position of power. Professionally, he is in a position of power and have such influence that he needs to be his accountability is of a higher level. Therefore, he becomes inexcusable in these affairs. It is much like the counselor going off with a counselee, much like a teacher and getting involved with a student. And so the pastor must take seriously his call, his spiritual identity, his professional identity, and thus carry greater responsibility, greater accountability, greater caution, so that something like this doesn't happen. Because when that happens, there is the devastation not only to his home and or spouse and or children, but the other person, the person with whom there is the affair, and that person's spouse, as the case may be, so that the ramifications are very far and deep. Then it gets to the church. And then it must be an issue that the organization or his employing organization must address and deal with. What therefore happens in this situation is that the organization takes the position then of having to take action on that pastor, which comes in a number of, you may say, ways or processes, including the removal of membership. And then there's the rescinding or the nullification or withdrawal of the ordination assignment.
And but you know, Pastor Browne, again, I am, there's so much that I want to react to there, but I want to slow back and slow down a little bit. And there are two questions that have a similar nature. So I'm going to ask them both from some of our viewers. And then I want to go back to some of the issues that you're uncovering right there. One, I'll ask both questions because they're so similar. One question is, what known conditions could be described as a moral fall? And the second question is, when addressing moral falls, it appears that the emphasis is often on sexuality. What about lying, stealing, impropriety of other kinds? These two questions, if you could just, quickly respond to those before I get back to some of the things you're talking about here.
Okay, thank you. It's almost easy to dismiss the others, not because they're not important or serious, but because they are not handled in the same way or impacting people emotionally as does the moral fall. But yes, lying, stealing, all these are wrong and terrible, and they should not be found in ministry. And when there is a public, and mark you, that's the other thing, private versus public is a very important, you may say, marker in discussing these matters. Because as in some of my reading would point out, in terms of the sin, and that's also the reason for the ultimate forgiveness factor when that comes in, because it is to be pointed out. And when Jesus describes adultery, he talks of seeing a person and lusting and wanting. So you could do that in your mind, which means all pornography is adultery. And so that is wrong, that is bad. However, again, pornography happens, as it were, in your private life and is not impacting persons publicly, and that's where there is a difference. But it is sin, it is wrong, and needs repentance, needs to be corrected, needs to be treated with therapy, etc., etc. Similarly, if you're a congenital liar and so on, then you need to get help and correct that. If you're caught stealing the money, again, that now can be considered a public one, especially if it is publicized or made known. Then indeed the church can and will take action disciplinary-wise with a person. So I want it to be clear that in some regard, sin is sin. However, there is a certain way in which the moral fall, the adulterous relationship impacts in a personal, devastating way more than some of the other things that we've had to deal with in terms of human inconsistency and spiritual shortcomings.
Maybe this is a good time to ask this question, again from one of our viewers. And the question is, what mechanisms are in place within our structure for the early identification of triggers which may over time lead to moral fall? A very important question.
Very important question. Very good question indeed. Now, to be honest, I think I would have to concur with some of what I've read, that the church has not been, the organization has not been sufficiently proactive in protecting, that is how it is stated one way, in protecting the pastor or the leader of the church and so forth. But in the context of how you're asking it is to pick up some of these triggers before. And yes, there is the need to do more in that area. And our church also is learning and is making effort to expand in that very arena. It is not always easy, but they have, for example, there has been the advocacy of having accountability partners or having mentors with whom one can speak, one can share, one could ask questions, and who could ask questions of you and really check to see how you're going. That is highly recommended. That has been recommended for a long time, but lots of us pastors have not practiced it, and I don't know that the organization has insisted upon it. The organization, however, has been more and more been providing additional support for pastors in terms of giving them access to counseling, to retreats, and opportunities that could have them assess what is happening in their own lives and marriages, etc. Hence, there is effort ongoing, but we need to continue, as we may say, to grow on that, develop that. The North American division, for example, has had ongoing efforts in finding ways to minister to fallen pastors with a view of doing something redemptive, something that ultimately, rather than leave them out of ministry permanently, to allow some kind of rehabilitation. I am aware that even when I was involved in ministry, led by the initiative of my ministerial secretary, the North Caribbean Conference engaged a contract with Ministry Care Line that would allow a pastor who needs help or is having difficulties or have concerns about things in his life to seek help and get it without having to report to the conference or having the conference directly know anything about his confidential issues. And so these are some of the initiatives that would have given protection. In fact, I happened in context of this to have interviewed Pastor Williams and recognized that he's looking in that direction for the entire union, and they have already begun some process of that in the Caribbean Union, of having pastors exposed to the ministry care line, and that would allow them to get help for them or their families as is needed. So there is some effort made, but I cannot say it is enough, and know that it is not all even fully staked out yet, or I don't want to use the word funded, but in other words, it's a growing process at this time, but it's a good direction and good question and concern.
It is occurring to me, Pastor Browne, as you know, as we're talking, and this is going on me here, that what we're doing this afternoon is that we're having a discussion that is very unusual.
Uh-huh.
We generally do not have this kind of discussion
Right. You've been doing some of those.
but I think it's an important discussion because sometimes folks are not aware sufficiently of some of the issues involved, and perhaps this awareness can make perhaps some members a little more sensitive to their pastors. For example, and I'm watching the time and I'm looking at so many questions that are coming in, but I recall while I was in CUC, I was in the era of CUC likewise, but while I was in CUC, preparing for ministry, I read an article in a ministry magazine that really gripped my attention. Now, I don't remember the title of the article, but the story is, it was actually written by a Baptist minister who was sharing his experience. And he said, that his wife divorced him. And that ended his ministry. And what is interesting here, because earlier you said that sometimes, when the pastor becomes successful, his family suffers.
Yes.
And he said that oftentimes he would ask his wife, how are things going? And she would respond, oh, it's fine. I know what ministry is all about. I understand. And then on one occasion, they were having a celebration, a birthday party for one of their children. And he said in the midst of the party, he discovered that his wife was absent. And so he looked around, didn't see her, climbed the stairs. It was in their home, climbed the stairs, opened the bedroom and saw his wife crying on the bed.
Wow.
And he said, sweetheart, what's wrong? And she looked at him. And for the first time, he's hearing that something was wrong. And she said, I want a divorce.
Wow.
I can't take this any longer. And she proceeded to get the divorce, and that ended his ministry.
Yeah.
But here was a wife who was all along saying, obviously pretending that everything was fine. She understood that ministry is involved and that he had to be out of the home a lot. But deep down inside, she was suffering, and it got to breaking point. And so it came to him like a bomb. So I'm saying that sometimes members perhaps understanding some of the issues and challenges, you call a pastor, the pastor responds right away. But I do want to run on to another issue here, Pastor Browne. There is, and this one again is a little uncomfortable, but I've heard stories. Let me put it that way. Now, you have been an administrator of vast experience, so you could determine. But there is the saying, popular enough, that sometimes officials hear of a moral discretion of a pastor, perhaps a charge of
moral indiscretion,
getting involved in some illicit affair. And then what is done is that pastor is transferred from that district, from that location, to another location. What's wrong or right about that?
Okay, very good question. And maybe I should promptly say for the records, God has been very good to me in my administration. You guys have behaved yourselves quite well, so that in my 12 years of presidency in administration, I have not had a case that I've had to deal with in the North Caribbean Conference that came to me sort of clear. I must, by the same token, admit that I've heard of one rumor that never really materialized into anything that came to be addressed, so to speak. But on your question, I have heard of a number of those cases. And yes, they have admitted to that being a practice in some parts of our world, particularly North America. And in a sense, that is not authorized by the policy. And that is part of the reason why there is such a strong emphasis or effort right now for them to redo, rewrite, and expand things to allow for what you have just said to be real, to happen. Because they're admitting that while it is serious and all that we have said to be true, the other reality is that it is possible that a person who could have made a mistake and with proper therapy and with the right attitude and remorse, be re-baptized, readmitted into church life, and may even be possible to have a profitable ministry. The biggest challenge for the pastor is the issue of loyalty and trust. So it is, even though the church is willing to forgive, it may not be able to convince people of the pastor's loyalty and trustworthiness, which is why, in an effort to be redemptive, some have sometimes where they get a clear impact of honesty, due accountability, remorse, willingness to get the appropriate therapy, etc., then give a person another opportunity, but have him removed from where that is not known. And in a lot of ways, that is viewed as reasonable and redemptive. However, like I said, in most cases, that is not yet voted policy, and there is much, you may say, representation for us to move in that direction, which in itself is fraught with challenge for administration, because some may view it as growth and a better theological, grace-oriented response to the challenge. Others may view it as the church becoming more like the world and being liberal, which is why I really plead with pastors to give due consideration to their situation and save themselves and the church the pain of this particular problem.
Now, it may be useful for us to give some tips, but there are several questions that I would like us to answer, and very important questions. So I'm going to go quickly with these.
Okay.
This first one is asking, at what time and under what circumstances does it become best to terminate the pastor's employment in the context of a known moral indiscretion?
Well, it would have to be almost immediately, because the moment it is known, the moment it is public, then it means that he has lost his moral authority and trust within that congregation. And so the church would have to move very quickly to do it. And when I say immediately, that would be within the matter of weeks and nothing more than, say, a month or two. That is the situation. Now, the redemptive aspect could be getting him help, therapy, retreats, programs that may be available to help the pastor in recovering the situation, because the caring church would also want to remember those children if children are involved, and the spouse. So you can't just get a pound of flesh by disciplining the pastor. You now need, as a Christian community, to be seeking to find ways of rehabilitating the family.
And that's indeed very important. But here's another question. I'm sorry I have to be rushing like this, but here's another question. This one is an interesting question. Does living above one's means and financing it by borrowing from the membership and not repaying amounts to a moral challenge?
Somewhat, but it's, yes, okay, it is, and that's not nice, and a pastor should get help and correct that as quickly as possible. He should get help and correct that as quickly as possible. I, however, think that is something that needs administrative help and counsel rather than a disciplinary action, as in the case of a moral fall.
Yeah, I mean, if it becomes one thing and another, if it becomes systemic,
right,
then we, but we move on. Another question. Oh, sorry about that. Missed that one. Here we are now. This one. Okay. Should the pastor be investigated if there is rumored he and I'm adding, or she is doing any of the listed, I suppose, what we spoke about earlier. And by who? Oh, by who? The church or the conference?
Okay, fine. The last part is easy, as it applies to the minister. It should be by the conference and not the local church in terms of that investigation. And members should know that that's why we have a ministerial secretary, and a ministerial secretary would seek, as it were, to counsel the pastor and to guide him and kind of be that intermediary between him and the administration of the conference. So you should get help from the ministerial secretary. And yes, the pastor should be investigated. However, let it be clear that it cannot be a gossipy, flimsy thing. If it is indeed a problem and a serious issue, somebody needs to step up and say, yes, I can be quoted, or I am making this this complaint and or lodging this concern, so that the ministerial secretary or administration doesn't look as if we're listening to gossip, because that is something that one could charge leadership with very easily, and which is really not a pleasant thing, even for leadership. So if you know that there are issues out there that are serious, that you think need to be handled or is embarrassing to the church, you should be willing to come forward and state them and allow administration or leadership to address them.
Now, I'm glad you are retired, Pastor Browne, because you're going to be able to respond to this question a little better. Are there, we're talking about moral failures, and is it, from your perspective as a leader, would you say to a pastor, listen, anytime something of this nature happens, be careful, that's it. There's no getting around it. You're going to be dismissed.
Okay, fine. Well, and let me, right before me now, I would just read. In fact, there's an important one to quotation I would have wanted to read earlier, but I'm going to read to you the response of Dr. Kiss, Milovis Kiss, the ethics professor at Andrews University for 31 years, and who has written the most on this subject, 8 articles in the Ministry magazine 2004 and 2005, 6 in 2004, 2 in 2005. And in this article, which he says, dealing with a fallen pastor, he gave all the various things and the concerns and so on. Then he comes down, and I'm glad he did not leave us hanging. He said, in my view, and notice that's just his view, because remember I said otherwise earlier on, the pastor who loses his credentials due to adultery remains a former pastor for the rest of his life. Full stop. During the time, he may be involved in a therapy process, and assuming his environment is helping all who hurt, the former pastor assists his own healing. As time passes and wounds are mended, these very painful trials may equip him to reach out to others who are tempted or overcome by temptation. He may remember the care that he and his family, as well as the family of the other woman, received from the local church and the church's administrative office. Such a former pastor may also recall what was lacking and work to improve the healing ministry for the fallen. So here is one church professor and leader who felt that, listen, it is terminal for that person. Not that the person becomes useless, but now that person can, in his own way, use that experience to still reach out and help others and minister to others, but to reinstate him in ministry, he is not of that school. But I could read to you, on the other hand, the extensive research, and portions of the extensive research. There is a Dr. Bissell, who did his dissertation on this subject. His doctoral dissertation. He's written some 280 something pages of it. I haven't read all of that thing, but I've read the some of the conclusions and the abstract, etc., etc. And it is Restoring Fallen Pastors, a study on restoring and reinstating clergy who have been involved in sexual misconduct. And that, in his findings, he basically feels that the Bible and Ellen White allows, difficult as it may be, for the reinstatement of a fallen pastor. And his research, he's saying that some 3/4 of the pastors in the North American division feel that they need to, in other words, move towards expanding, growing, where they can begin to do something like that. Remember, they're not there yet, but there is sympathy with going in that direction as a redemptive approach, as a grace orientation approach, hopefully not just being liberal.
Not Pastor, very insightful. I'm craving your indulgence for us to take an extra 5 or so minutes. We did have a little disruption at the beginning of the top of the hour.
Thank you. My apologies for that. Yes.
And just for the sake of dealing with some of the what I consider to be important questions that coming in, then I want to express gratitude for your cooperation here. Here is a question. This individual is both asking a question and making a statement.
Okay.
It is it really? Maybe it's more of a statement, but I'll read it anyhow. It is impossible to regain trust 100%, whether the fall involves funds, infidelity, or lying, whatever. Forgiveness, yes. Restoration, no. So the person here is very definite on that one. And I think earlier you were saying,
and they light up with kiss.
Yeah, you were commenting that it's one thing to forgive, it's another thing to restore, and how the extent to which members would trust that person. So here's a person who's saying, definitely not.
And that's the practical problem that pastors must understand how serious that is. Trust, loyalty.
Very interesting. Now, there are 2 questions, I think, that have similar themes. Let's see if I can get to this one. That have similar themes. This one, does forgiving a pastor for moral fall mean restoration? So this is
and the answer to that is no. And the church almost does not do that. Although, like I said, you pointed out earlier on, there are 1 or 2 people who are on their own have tried to slip the pastor to some other conference or move him far away and give him a second chance, because there are those who feel something redemptive should be able to happen in certain circumstances.
But and again, just so that we do not give the wrong impression here, if for whatever reason there is, administration feels that there is sufficient growth in this pastor, sufficient recovery, and they determine that they're going to place this pastor back in ministry in another area where the offense is not known. I heard of a case last year, to be exact, where there was a conference in Florida that was being sued.
Right. Yes.
And it's interesting, when I read
this year, a couple of months ago. Go ahead.
When I read the judgment, it said that the conference administration should have known, and that's what I found interesting. Should have known.
That's how the legal aspect goes. Very serious.
Yeah.
They say you should have known.
That's interesting. So one needs to understand that it is not just the matter of okay, we think the person has grown, but you put the person somewhere else and something happens, and then you're sued. And you're told that you knew that this person had that challenge. You had no right to do that.
Right.
Very interesting. Okay, we're going to take the last 2 questions. This one, Um, during the last few years, a number of people have been complaining about what they view as laziness in ministry. What can we say on that matter? Pastor Browne, as a retired
now,
administrator.
Let me be very, very, very candid here. Sadly and unfortunately, every now and then we encounter something like that or something that appears that way. It is unfortunate and it is wrong. And yes, pastors should be addressed on that, and action should be taken to get them more engaged. That having been said, and while it shouldn't be tolerable for a lazy pastor, a negligent or slothful pastor, certainly not even in this COVID time, because just like what you're doing, that's why I paid you the compliment I did up front, Elder, because actually a good pastor wants to see where I could find opportunity to minister and get things done using whatever means to execute. So laziness is not to be tolerated or is not acceptable. So I want to be relevant that clearly. But to balance that out though, some pastors overwork. Some pastors do too much. And I'm glad I get to make this point at the end at least, Elder. It is a responsibility of the organization, meaning the church members and the conference, to, in a sense, be active in protecting your pastor from overdoing it or overworking. And there are various recommendations, which we don't have time to go down now, that you can do, and starting with the local church to send the pastor on a 1-week retreat or date with his wife, taking over and keep the children, babysitting for the children, and get some refreshment for your pastor and help the pastor keep his marriage good and sound and attractive. So try to balance it, but no excuse for the lazy pastor.
Well, a final question, Pastor Browne, before I ask you to just give your wrapping up remarks here. This person is asking here, let me see if I can just pull this question quickly. And the question is perhaps a good one to end. Oh, where is it? I missed it. Okay. Yes, here it is. What counsel will you give to pastors in respect of how they mingle with and form relationships with members of the opposite sex?
Well, that's a big one. The first issue goes back to your first question. Awareness, your spiritual calling, your connectedness with God. Bear this in mind. And then as you mingle with the opposite sex, be open, be professional, be caring. It's the nature of the pastor. It's expected of you, but don't become too familiar. Don't overstep boundaries. In other words, you should be aware of boundaries. God, how much you hug and how much you kiss and whatnot and whatnot. Now, granted, I have experienced the works of it. In fact, I still remember in front of Shiloh Church, how one older sister, she would have been 20 or more years my senior, and she came and she not only kissed, she kissed me right on my lips. Couldn't do anything about it. It was out of my control, of course. But you have to be on guard to protect. But that should not be an initiation from you, the pastor. Interestingly, at Agape Church, where I pastored both churches, Shiloh and Agape, I had this struggle where I shake hands at Agape, at Shiloh. When I get over to Agape and I put out my hand, they knock my hand away and they say, we don't shake hands at Agape, we hug. And so you may find yourself in that. Stay fairly neutral, respect the culture of the church, but always become aware that you cannot be too familiar with or let down your guard with the opposite sex, and don't get into terrible jokes and smutty this and so forth. Keep your ethical dignity and your appropriate distance within the context of a warm, caring pastorate.
Pastor Browne, we thank you so much for sharing from your wealth of experience with us. There were more questions, but we just don't have the time.
Yes,
I want
I'm
to.
relieved, to be honest with you, to have come to the end.
I want to just remind our viewers that next week we have a very interesting discussion. We're going to be talking about the subject of Christmas. Should Adventists celebrate Christmas? And with us next week to discuss this very important, this very controversial subject on Christmas and how we celebrate it is Dr. Clinton Wellham, the Associate Director for the Biblical Research Institute. Seventh Adventist Biblical Research Institute. That promises to be a very interesting discussion. So we want to invite all of you to tell your friends to be back next week at 3 p.m. for that very important discussion. Should Adventists celebrate Christmas? Again, Pastor Browne, we were so blessed to have you with us today. And as we leave, we ran over time a little bit, but we do understand the nature of the subject. We hope to have you back on Let's Talk sometime else. And I'll give you a minute to share some final remarks.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity, which granted I was scared of, but I'm glad for the honor, and I respect that very much. I want to wish our listeners and brethren a strong Christian experience and growth. I plead with my pastors to appreciate the tightrope we must walk, but know that we can only do it in the strength of Jesus Christ, and that we must be willing to endure and to be committed, because ultimately there's not going to be any excuse or too much sympathy with a person held in such high regard and honor to not be able to hold his own, because the basic common member is going to say, if not the pastor, who? God help us to be faithful.
Thank you so much, Pastor Browne. And again, to all of our viewers, those of you who asked questions and didn't get it answered directly, we apologize for that. Next week, we are back here at 3 p.m. Our subject, should Adventists celebrate Christmas? And as I said, with us is going to be the Associate Director of the Biblical Research Institute. We are looking forward to having